Welcome to Feedback Studio. In other videos we've explored how to set up rubrics using the Rubric Manager, and we've already highlighted in other videos the 4 different types of rubrics that are available for you to use in Feedback Studio: the standard, the custom, the qualitative, and the grading form. In this video we're going to explore in more detail the imaginatively titled standard rubric, and to do this we're again going to be using the Rubric Manager, but this time, rather than accessing the Rubric Manager from Moodle, we're going to access it from the rubric settings icon in Feedback Studio itself. So, here first of all we have our Turnitin assignment set up in Moodle, and we're going to open one of the essays that has been submitted into it. Here we are. Now, those of you who remember using the older version of Turnitin might remember that the rubrics icon used to be hidden away in a corner as though embarrassed to be there. In Feedback Studio, the rubric icon is much clearer in the toolbar on the right hand side. If we click on the rubric icon, then the rubrics panel will open up. It's empty at the moment because we've not attached a rubric, and if you don't already know about the importance of attaching and detaching rubrics, then it's strongly advised you look at the video explaining this before you go much further. The first thing we need to do then is to go into the Rubrics Manager, and we can access this by clicking on the Settings icon in the Rubrics panel. There is a rubric already in here. This is the one we've used as an example in many of these videos. Now, this video is not about how to set up a rubric to begin with, so again, if you don't already have a rubric ready to use and don't know how to create one, then we recommend you looking at the video on creating a rubric. Now, this is the same Rubric Manager as the one that you may have used in the old Turnitin or directly from the Moodle plugin. All the functions are still here, but rather like many of the changes that we've seen between the old Turnitin and the new Feedback Studio, they've just been moved around a little and made to look prettier. We can still see the criteria listed down the left hand side, and the scales are still listed across the top. We can still edit the title of the rubric at the top, and the menu button is still there in the top left corner. What has disappeared is the import-export button that used to be in the top right. This has been replaced by a drop-down menu, enabling you to select which kind of rubric you want to use. For this video we're going to be looking at the standard form, so we'll keep this selected. The import and export functions have been moved into the menu, and their names have been changed to upload and download, which are perhaps a little more universally understood. They both work though in exactly the same way, and you can find out about uploading or importing rubrics using the template spreadsheet in the video on creating rubrics. The Attach and Detach button has moved as well. Before you would have found it in the top right, but it's now in the bottom left, and the slightly obscure icon has been replaced with a clear title and a slider to toggle between Attach and Detach. What we're most interested in now though is the rubric itself, because this is the standard rubric form, and you will see that there are 2 sets of numeric values. The criteria have percentage values next to them, and the scales along the top have number values. These numbers determine how Feedback Studio will use the rubric to give the assignment a grade. And in one sense, understanding this is actually very easy, but then in another sense, well, maybe not so much. But let's start with the easy. The percentage numbers next to the criteria are the relative weightings of each criteria. As you can see in this example, there are 4 criteria and each of them have been weighted at 25%. This means that each of the criteria are counted as equally important. Of course, this might not always be the case. For example, you might think that the demonstration of independent thought is more important than the grasp of basic concepts. And so you want the independent thought criteria to count for more than the one for key concepts. In which case what we can do is we can nudge the key concepts weighting down to 20% and nudge the independent thought up to 30%. Now, the grade you give for independent thought will count for 30% of the overall grade. So if you imagine we gave a grade of 60% for each criteria and the total grade comes to 60%, then key concepts would count for 12 of that total grade, and independent thought would count for 18. The rest, weighted at 25%, would count for 15 of the total grade, and it would all add up to 60. As long as the percentages next to the criteria always add up to 100, then you can vary the weightings to your heart's content, although obviously the more criteria you have, the more complicated the mathematics becomes. Okay, so much for the easy part. Now for the not so easy. The numbers alongside the scales represent the grades you give for each of the criteria. They act like grade bands. Each column represents one of those grade bands. For example, the first column might represent the highest grade band, and the last column on the right might represent the lowest grade band. Grade bands are at once one of the great advantages of using rubrics, and at the same time one of the things that takes the most getting used to. It's an advantage because using clearly determined grade bands eliminates much of the randomness of grading. As long as you specify your criteria and your characteristics clearly enough, then an assignment, well, it either demonstrates the right criteria for that grade band or it doesn't. Of course, specifying your criteria is in itself a complex task. You'll notice from this example the use of phrases like excellent and very good. These kind of phrases are generally unhelpful in a rubric because they're relatively undefined. If you were to simply say to a student, yes, you're very good but need to become excellent, then it can be frustratingly vague, and it does little in terms of actually providing feedback that can be actually acted on. With clear and specific criteria and characteristics, the grade assigned has a direct and clear logic and rationale, making it easier to assign the grade and, more importantly, easier for the student to understand why they have been given that grade. Now, this idea might take some getting used to, because if you've been in UK higher education for any length of time, then you will probably become very used to a system of fine grading work out of 100%, and in accordance to a specific set of grade descriptors that revolve around the undergraduate degree classifications of first, 2-1, 2-2 and third, that have often been associated with the broad terminology of excellent and very good that we were just discussing. Indeed, you may have built up years of experience in being able to recognise the subtle distinctions between a 68% and a 65%, for example. Rubrics and grade bands don't really work this way, as we'll see in a moment. They work better with clearly determined categories. However, because we realise that many of you might need to use a rubric within the framework of these degree classification percentages, we'll look at them now in these contexts and explore ways in which you can set up your rubric to produce a percentage fine grade. In this example, you can see that the scales have been set in accordance with the undergraduate degree grades of first, 2-1, 2-2, third, and fail. Of course, these aren't numbers, or at least they don't represent the numbers we would want to grade an assignment by. The degree classifications represent specific grade bands. A first is anything between 70 and 100%. A 2-1 is anything between 60 and 69%, and so on. We could just as easily name these bands excellent, very good, good, pass and fail. We could even name them Fred, Daphne, Velma, Shaggy and Scooby if we wanted to, which might be a bit silly, but in many ways probably makes about as much sense to students. These names then don't provide the numeric value which will be used for the grading. These numeric values actually appear in this little box alongside the scale titles. And here is where things can get a little bit messy because of the way Feedback Studio interprets these numbers. Perhaps the simplest way we could set up these grading numbers is to simply give each scale a number incrementally escalating from 1. So, for example, we could have a set of scales progressing from Scooby to Shaggy to Velma to Daphne to Fred, and we can give each of these scales the values 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. Fred scores the highest then. But then we need to understand what this means in terms of the overall grading. So let's go ahead and attach this rubric now and see what it looks like when we apply it. We can see the different criteria listed now, and the scales are represented by these number points. We can use the slides to attribute a grade to each of them. You can see that as we grade them, it shows you the scale title. There's Fred, Daphne, Velma and Shaggy. If you wanted to see the full descriptors for each criterion, then you can click on this little expand icon, and the rubric itself will open full screen where you can see all the details, and you can select the appropriate categories from this window. From here, we can see the grades that are going to be given in the essay: a 5 for key concepts, a 4 for analysis, a 3 for lucidity, and a 2 for independence. So what happens when we apply this grade? Well, if we click on Apply to Grade and then close the window, we can see that the essay has been given 3.5 out of 5, which leaves us with a percentage grade of 70%. Now this is where we can encounter some problems. This grade may well be perfectly fine. It's actually nice and easy to give each scale a numeric value like this across a minimal number of scales. And you might find that this would work particularly well with formative assignments. For many summative assignments at UEL though, you're going to be grading using a percentage, which means out of 100, and the default setting for Feedback Studio is 100%. Now you can change this of course via the Turnitin settings in Moodle, and you can find out more about this in the video on setting up the Moodle plugin. As things stand though, when you scale this down to a smaller figure, grading out of 50 say, or 20, or in this case 5, you'll often find that when this grade is converted into a percentage, it does not fit comfortably within the established classification boundaries. Looking at this grade as an example, the essay is being given a Fred, a Daphne, a Velma and a Shaggy. And if you think about this in terms of an average, then the grade should reflect a standard of something between Velma and Daphne. Using our undergraduate classification head, this would probably mean a grade of somewhere around 55%, a 2-2. But the rubric has actually awarded the essay 70%, which would count as a first. So what we need to do is to find a way in which we can ensure that the final assignment grade is appropriate. Obviously, there is an argument here in which we might question the value of grading out of 100 in the first place, but this isn't really the place to delve too deeply into that question. So assuming, at least for now, that we're stuck with fine grading, there are two possible ways that we can address the problem. The quickest way would be to simply overwrite the grade. And we can do this by just clicking in the little grade box and adding our own grade. Now this is something we can do with any rubric, and it's always good to remember that we have this option and that we're never actually held hostage by the rubric. The problem with this though is that we now have two conflicting sets of numbers. There's the average grade of the rubric and there's a final grade in the grade box. and this might cause some confusion for students when they see the grades. You could, of course, add an explanation for this in the long-form feedback section, but this would look rather clumsy, and it would be unlikely to significantly reduce any confusion. So, rather than writing in the grade box and overwriting the grade, hang on a second. Hey, there we go. Where was I? Oh yes. So rather than overwriting the grade, it would be better if we can get the rubric to grade the essay more accurately in relation to our classifications. And this is done by simply changing the scores for each of the grades. Let's go back to the rubric and see how this might work. Of course, in order to edit the rubric, we need first to detach it from the essay. You'll know about this if you've already seen the video on attaching and detaching rubrics. I'm going to switch back for a moment though to this earlier rubric, because here we have used the undergraduate degree classifications for our scale titles. According to these classifications, for a first we want anything between 70 and 100%. And for a 2-1, we want anything between 60 and 69. For the 2-2, we want anything between 50 and 59. And for a third, anything between 40 and 49. And to fail is anything under 40. Okay, so let's think about this. We could simply put 70 for a first, 60 for a 2-1, 50 for a 2-2, and so on. It leaves us with a conundrum about what to put for a fail, because this could be anything between 0 and 39%, but let's go with 20 for now and see what happens. I'll save the rubric and then attach it to the essay. Now let's do the same thing we did last time. For key concepts, I'll give it a first. For analysis, a 2-1. For lucidity, a 2-2. And for independence, a third. Now the rubric grade looks okay. 55, sounds about right. The problem is it's 55 out of 70. This means that when I apply this to the grade, our final score comes out at 79%, which is even higher than when we simply used 1 to 5 of us as our scale. The problem we have is that whatever number we use as the highest grade, Feedback Studio will count as 100%. When we had the numbers of 1 to 5, 5 counted as 100%. Now we have 20 to 70 as our scales, 70 is counted as 100%. What we need is for 100 to be counted as 100%. How do we do this? Actually, it's quite simple. We just add another scale for 100% in our rubric. I'm going to go back and detach the rubric form from the essay again so that I can edit it. And now I'm going to click on the small plus sign in the scale section to add a new scale. I don't need to add a title right now, but I'm going to add a score of 100. Save and attach. Now let's try again. For key concepts, I'll give a first. For analysis, 2-1. For lucidity, 2-2. And for independence, a third. There is the 55. But note that this time it's 55 out of 100. This means that when I click on the Apply to Grade, we now get the same grade that we can see for the rubric, 55. Excellent. Let's see if there are any other ways in which we can improve the accuracy of the grade. If, for example, I apply a 2-1 for each of the criteria, then everything shows up as 60, and the overall grade is, well, obviously, 60. This might not entirely reflect the standard of the assignment, though. After all, there's a wide spectrum between 60, which is just scraping a 2-1, and say 68, which suggests that the work is really pushing up towards the first. As I mentioned earlier, rubrics tend to work in terms of meeting specific criteria. The essay either meets the criteria for this level or it doesn't. In terms of classification, this means that the essay either is a 2-1 or it isn't. There are no margins. If this is so, then perhaps rather than setting 60 for the 2-1 category, would be better off setting it as a secure 65. A 2-2 would therefore be 55, and a third 45. When we come to the categories for a first or for a fail, of course, we encounter a problem, because while the percentage gap between a third and a 2-2 and a 2-2 and a 2-1 is always 10%, the range for a first is 30%, and the range for a fail is 39%. There is therefore, presumably, a big difference between an essay that gets 70 and one that gets 100. We could create more scales, having different scales for, well, say, anything between 0 and 10%, or perhaps a new scale for anything above 80%. The problem with this is that, well, there's no end to how far you can keep going, dividing up into countless different scales that really makes the rubric itself cumbersome to use and rather defeats the object. Alternatively, we could split the difference by giving every first-class essay 85% and every fail 20%. Well, maybe not the best solution, but it will do for now, so let's go ahead and put that in. Okay, there we have it. Standard rubrics can be rather complicated, especially if you are trying to cram it into a standard set of classifications spread across 100 points. You might find this more useful for maybe formative assignments or assignments where you have the flexibility to grade according to different scales and classifications.